I'm the past president of the Lincoln Group. Ed Epstein, the current president, can't be here tonight because he has a very special event he couldn't miss. So he's missing tonight. So I'm gonna host tonight, and I'm gonna also start with a short presentation about the Lincoln Group 90th anniversary. So we've been doing this each month, and we'll continue doing it each month this year, talking about something about the Lincoln Group history. So we started in 1935, but as a group, but we did not have a newsletter until around 1957. And so I'm going to talk about the newsletter tonight because later this month, we'll have a newsletter come out. So the first newsletter, as far as I can tell, and I'll say there's a little bit of gaps in what I have, and I'm still going through the information from the archives. So there may be more information, and I'm finding occasionally I find a folder that will just have some random random Lincolnian issues in it. So I'm still putting them together. But from what I have, we started in 1957, and Bert Sheldon started the first newsletter. It was just a way to help communicate information to the membership, which was national. And in fact, we had quite a bit of people nationally at the time. So he did it for maybe a couple of years. And in July of August, and so I have some of these newsletters. So I'm not going to show them all or talk about them all, but I just want to kind of go through them. So after a couple of years, Paul Gant took over as the newsletter editor. And he went from what I have, July, August 1959 to August of 1961. And you can figure out like how many years ago that was. It was a lot of years. So Paul Gant was the newsletter editor. And then from November 1961 until February of 1970, so about 9 years, the newsletter editor was George Landis, who was also a president of Lincoln Group at some point, I think after this. He was a newsletter editor for quite some time, for nine years. But in the February of 1970 was our last issue, because they decided at that time that it was getting too costly, the postage and the printing. All of these newsletters were mailed out. This was pre-PDFing everything and mailing it. So they stopped in 1970, but they started up again, and we have the September-October issue of 1982. So it was quite a gap before they started up again. And in 1982, the editor was George Landis. He came back and reestablished the newsletter with that issue in 1982. And in fact, he had been the editor earlier. So he was, he knew what he was doing. So he did that for like 1970. Then we went through a period where we had shorter periods of editors. So from September, October 1982 to January, February 1984. And again, there may be some gaps, but in that general area, that was George Landis. I'm sorry. So from July, August 1984 to January, February 1985, Ed Steers was the newsletter editor. Then from 1986, I have one issue from 1986 that featured, that was edited by not Edward Steers, next one. So it was edited by Edward Bastek. It was before my time, so I apologize if I got his name wrong. Edmund Bastek. And I only have one issue, but apparently he did it for 2 or 3 years, couple of years at least. And then he retired to focus on research. But the interesting thing is that this only issue I currently have, and I'm sure there are more, March, April 1986, has an article in there, has a photo of Lloyd Ostendorf, the artist and Lincoln Group member, with a guy by the name of Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. Now, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, I'm sure everybody knows. The reason he's in here is because they announced a short memo on the last page of this, announcing that Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, at the age of 81, had passed away on Christmas Eve of 1985, so a couple months before. Of course, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith was the grandson of Robert Lincoln, great grandson of Abraham Lincoln, and he was the last direct descendant of Abraham Lincoln. After that, there's no direct descendants of Abraham Lincoln. So that was pretty interesting about that particular issue. Then we had from September, October 1988 to March, April 1990, Carolyn Quadarella was the editor of the Lincolnian, and it was the Lincolnian this entire time from the beginning. So she was the editor for 2 or 3 years, and then was taken over, and I have May, June 1990 through November, December 1992. Apparently he did it for 3 years, was Paul Verdun. He was the editor. So for about 3 years. And now that gets us to January, February of 1993. And on the front page of the January, February 1993 issue of the Lincolnian, remember, these were all mailed out, so nice folded pages. There's an article, and it says, with this issue, Paul H. Verdun ends his 3-year tenure as editor of the Lincolnian. In his place, Lincoln Group of DC President Carolyn Quadarella has appointed Wendy Swanson, who until recently had been editor of this Volksmarch Club's newsletter in the Washington area. And Verdun had left in order to work on Lincoln research. So I'm going to let you do the math, but from January, February of 1993 until the present, with the issue that's coming out
32 years.
And continuing, hopefully, the editor of the Lincolnian was Wendy Swanson. So if we do the math, that's 33 years and counting that Wendy has been the editor of the Lincolnian. So if you have not shown your appreciation to Wendy for the great content and quality of the newsletters today, you should at least show your appreciation for her stamina of being able to do this. Really? 33 years after about 30 years or so of other people doing it, 40 years of other people doing it. So that was my 90th anniversary little tidbit from our archives, and I'll have something more next month. I'm not sure I'll have it for this next meeting in April, but for next month I'll do it. And if you have any ideas of topics you want me to try to dig into and look into, some major event that you want to talk about, just send me an email, and I'll try to dig it out. Otherwise, I'm just finding things as I find them as I go through the records. So with that, let's get to the main event tonight, and I will turn it over to John Willen, who will introduce our speaker, John O'Brien.
Thank you. To be honest with you, I think if this group, John O'Brien is a guy who needs no introduction, because I think everybody knows John, but I will go ahead and formally introduce him to you. John is a past president and current board member of the Lincoln Group. He's an independent researcher who writes and lectures on Lincoln and religion and culture in early 19th century America. He is the Lincoln historian at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church here in Washington. John's most recent article, which appeared last year in the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, is a contextualized analysis of Lincoln's meditations on the divine will, assessing that it was part of his preparation for the Emancipation Proclamation. John's research has been acknowledged by John Meacham in his book, And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle, who we've had as a speaker, and in Richard Carradine's just released Righteous Strife, How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. He is currently writing the biography of Civil War pastor in Washington, the Reverend Phineas Densmore Gurley, who was present, of course, at the Peterson House. John now resides in Denver, Colorado, and he is definitely a busy man.
Thank you very much, John.
Turn it over to you.
Today, we are 1 week away from being able to commemorate the 160th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Tonight, I will present an overview of some of the most persistent conspiracy theories surrounding that grave national tragedy. Though they continue in spite of a well-developed historical record, conspiracy theorists still bring new interest to the perverse way of the enduring legacy of Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14, 1865. The assassination, the search for the conspirators, and the overnight vigil until his death at 7:22 a.m. on Saturday morning have become the single most written about event in American history. Because of its significance and continuing public fascination, it has also been the subject of more than the usual number of conspiracy theories. The physicians who attended Lincoln in the theater box recognized immediately that the wound would prove fatal. They agreed that trying to remove him to the White House over the rough city roads would likely speed his death. They organized a team of 6 men to carry him from the theater. But to where? April 14 coincided with the Good Friday on the Christian calendar that commemorates the death of Christ. Someone suggested the tavern next door. The owner was present and quickly declined, crying, "The president must not die in a saloon." Well, nor should he die in a theater. This dimly lit painting by an eyewitness shows Lincoln being borne by loving hands, the title of the painting, across the street to the man pointing at the Peterson House, and that's how the decision was made. The death vigil took place in the rear first-floor bedroom. There have been many prints prepared to represent the death scene. The small bedroom has been characterized by historians as the rubber room because it can be expanded to include all the prominent men that the artist wanted to make sure were there for the event. This print by John Littlefield was Mary Lincoln's favorite because it included her at her husband's bedside. Most of the graphics excluded her for being less historically significant. I'll highlight the man standing in the right foreground, hands behind his back. This is Lincoln's pastor in Washington, the Reverend Dr. Phineas Gurley of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. His participation in the vigil had been used to diminish the potential scandal of the president being in a theater on a sacred night. Gurley was a reliable and confidential friend of the president who received little attention in the literature. I'm now completing his first biography for publication, hopefully next year. Regardless of the sacrilegious timing, the idea of Lincoln as martyr developed almost immediately. The third most popular category of prints was that of depicting his apotheosis, or ascent into heaven, and alignment with the saintly Washington under the motto, "Washington made our country and Lincoln saved it," or alternatively, redeemed it. Lincoln's protracted funeral began in Washington on April 19 and continued using a special train car to retrace his journey as president-elect back to the final services at Springfield, Illinois on May 4. Over 12 days, the train moved slowly through populated areas and stopped at major cities for local services. Nearly 1 million people filed by his coffin during this trip. This procession was in Chicago. At each stop along the way, children would be invited to lay flowers on the president's casket. This representative bouquet has been preserved in the Smithsonian. When he returned to Washington, Pastor Gurley called on Mrs. Lincoln, who did not make the journey to Springfield. He related the story of a little girl who approached him saying that Mrs. Lincoln should get some flowers too. and she asked him to present hers. One of the first questions raised that became a subject of conspiracy charges was the matter of Lincoln's security that night. Officer John F. Parker of the Metropolitan Police was assigned to guard the president. He and Lincoln's aide, Charles Forbes, escorted the Lincolns to their theater box. Forbes took a seat just outside the box door. Several witnesses testified that Lincoln was heard to dismiss Parker, telling him to get a seat wherever he could and enjoy the play. Parker had a questionable character and the record of a troubled man. He, in fact, went to the bar adjacent to the theater. But Lincoln had sent him off, and he was never the focus of an investigation. As for Charles Forbes, there was no reason that he would block the famous actor, John Wilkes Booth, when he presented his card to see the president. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton essentially took charge of the government at Lincoln's bedside in the Peterson house. He organized the search for the assassins. Booth, in the center on this wanted poster, was quickly identified as the killer, and the first conspirators identified were his companion, David Harold, on the right, and John Surratt. Over the next 2 weeks, details of Booth's escape route through southern Maryland were determined. He was shot for resisting his capture in Richard Garrett's barn on April 26. The site is now in the 301 Expressway median strip in Fort Walker, Virginia, formerly known as AP Hill. Visits are not recommended. The decision was made by President Johnson to try the assassination conspirators by military tribunal rather than in a civil court. The stated reason was that Washington had been under martial law. The real reason was likely concern that the Washington civil jury pool would include many Southern sympathizers. But this decision alone has been a topic of lively speculation that Johnson was trying to control the evidence presented and the outcome. 4 conspirators were publicly executed at the Arsenal Penitentiary at the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia Rivers on July 7, 1865. They were David Harold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt. The investigation and trial records are as well developed and thorough as any in that period of our history. But certain questions went unanswered, and not all possible themes were developed at trial. Covering all potential storylines is never possible for reasons of due process, expediency, and limited resources. And therein lies the fuel for conspiracies. I will limit discussion today to the 6 major conspiracy themes that to some extent continue to pop up today. Those 6 themes are: 1, the Confederates did it, which would justify Northern retribution. And in fact, there is some evidence that at some level the Confederate government was involved, if not directly in the assassination. 2, the Catholics. Pope Pius IX ordered it. This was consistent with the anti-Catholic bias of the area and John Surratt's involvement, which we'll describe. Booth escaped and they buried the wrong guy is another theme, and this is more attributed to the durability of the South and the lost cause narrative that Booth and the South will rise again, and other confusing issues there. Vice President Andrew Johnson did it. Logically, he was the immediate beneficiary of the assassination, and so there was attention on him quickly, and it continues to linger in some quarters. The radical Republicans hated Lincoln because they wanted a harsher Reconstruction policy, and therefore they were responsible for the assassination. And finally, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was behind it all because people didn't trust the government, and he represented the government. John Surratt was Mary's son. He exists today at the nexus of several of these theories. There is no doubt that he was one of the first recruited by Booth for his original plan to kidnap Lincoln and transport him to Richmond. John was a Confederate government agent and messenger using the route through southern Maryland to New York City and on to Montreal, Canada. When Surratt learned of Lincoln's assassination, he was in Elmira, New York, assigned to plan the release of rebel POWs from the prison camp there. He fled to Montreal and then to Europe, where he enlisted in the Vatican's Swiss Guards protecting the Pope. Here he is wearing that uniform. He fled when recognized and was apprehended in Egypt. He was returned to the United States for trial in June 1867. But the nation's fury had been spent. Even though he was much more involved with Booth than his mother, John was found not guilty by a civil court and released. John Surratt has become a feature of the Catholic, Confederate, and Stanton theories ever since. There are several secondary sources for stories that John Wilkes Booth had never really been captured. Legends abound for which no original documentation can be found. In 1903, a former Attorney General of Tennessee, Finis Bates, spoke with a man who claimed to be Booth and gave convincing details. When this Booth died, an undertaker embalmed the body, which no one claimed. Finis Bates soon acquired the mummified remains and charged admission to the public to view the corpse in a traveling show. Many agreed that the corpse could be that of Booth, and Finis made a fortune with his show. He sold the mummy to another collector in the 1970s and has disappeared from public notice. There were several other deathbed confessions by men claiming to be Booth, so the story of Booth's escape continued to fuel public interest, particularly among those who believed that the Confederacy, like Booth, would soon rise again. Countering Bates, however, is the fact that Booth had been buried 3 times. Each time he was positively identified by numerous family members, as well as surgeons or dentists who had worked on him. His final resting place is in Baltimore's Greenmount Cemetery, where the unmarked gravestone receives pennies from visitors who wish to affirm that it was Lincoln who triumphed. An immigrant scientist who developed a reputation as a Civil War scholar, Otto Eisenschimel, published a book in 1937 titled, "Why Was Lincoln Murdered?" The book raised questions about the assassination investigation process. Eisenschimel strongly hinted that evidence which pointed to Stanton and radical Republicans had been suppressed, without making any specific accusations. Of course, this was the vehicle by which all conspiracy instigators get started. The claim that I am just asking questions, or I have been told without attribution from someone who is in a position to likely know better, is very intriguing to many who may not be well informed. The key part of Eisenschimmel's thesis is the so-called John Wilkes Booth diary. Booth carried a daybook for his schedule and notes. He was in the habit of tearing out pages from his book as he wrote notes to people. Several of those notes have been recovered with the printed date from this book. The printed date on this page, which is the first of the remaining pages, is June 11, 1865. But Booth has dated the entry on this first page as April 14, the day of the assassination. The text is his rationalization for the crime, apparently hoping to be justified in history. The original documentation of this diary by the officers at Garrett's barn who removed it from Booth's pocket states that the pages were already missing. Later reports by others not directly involved said that there were no missing pages, raising confusion. Eisenschimel seized on this to surmise that the pages may have been removed by government officials because they likely incriminated Stanton and/or the radical Republicans. During the mid-20th century, several reports were made of the discovery of previously unknown papers related to the assassination. Somehow, the original documents had been lost, but these transcripts tended to incriminate government officials. One of those was the discovery of the purported lost pages from the diary of radical Republican Congressman George Julian. That purported lost entry is this. I was summoned to the office of Secretary Stanton. On entering, I immediately knew something was amiss. Stanton said, "We have Booth's diary and he has recorded a lot." Senator Kness was reading it and moaning, "Oh my God, I'm ruined if this ever gets out." Stanton pressed me to read it, saying, "It concerns you, for we either stay together in this thing or we will all go down together, down the river together." This entry, unfortunately, does not exist. Julian's diary does, in fact, exist in the museum today. So it is available to researchers, and this entry was fabricated probably by someone who wasn't aware the diary was out there. but this made wide circulation in the conspiracy theory circles. Other unsubstantiated documents were described in the 1977 book, The Lincoln Conspiracy. This argument was amplified by the NBC television series Unsolved Mysteries, hosted by actor Robert Stack, which lives forever on the internet. They gave credence to a new wave of conspiracies building on the books already in circulation. These are the key conspiracy theory books, which go through the most effort to attempt to reconstruct the story of the assassination. The Suppressed Truth About the Lincoln Assassination from 1922, Why Was Lincoln Murdered? Otto Eisenschimmel's book in 1937, The Lincoln Conspiracy in 1977 with Balsinger and Selye, and finally, The Dark Union, The Secret Web That Led to Lincoln's Death by Guttridge and Neff in 2003. Again, resurrecting purported documents. The originals can never be located, but these are what they certify as originals, but this can't track them back to any documentable source. The most widely read book about Lincoln ever published was Bill O'Reilly's Killing Lincoln. Published in 2010, it sold over 20 million copies. The book is very controversial because it contains no footnotes or even a suggestion of any sources. It invents dialogue and features the private thoughts of Booth without any evidence. Many historians consider it a work of fiction, but it includes the suggestion of government conspiracies and the likely role of Secretary Sten, resurrecting the work of Eisenschimmel and other conspiracy theorists without referencing any credible sources. Here are some of the best researched, well-written, and critically acclaimed books about the Lincoln assassination. Several spend time dispelling these controversies. I put number one on the list is Blood on the Moon by our own Ed Steers. This is very well researched and documented. I would call it the ultimate source for the assassination details. It is complementary to Ed's masterful work in the Lincoln Assassination Encyclopedia, which is also published around this time. Manhunt by James Swanson is a well-documented study of the search for Booth and the aftermath. The Lincoln Assassination Riddle by Frank Williams and Michael Berkheimer was a collection of research papers. American Brutus, John Wilkes Booth by Michael Kaufman. Beware the People Weeping is a focused effort to discredit the conspiracy theories, particularly the ones that purport to have been based on documents that were discovered in the 1950s in the carriage house for General the guy who wrote Ben-Hur. He apparently had a cache of these documents, which nobody knew about, and they couldn't find the originals, but they found transcripts and based.
Lou Wallace.
Lou Wallace, thank you very much. And finally, Confronting Bad History, how a lost cause of in the fraudulent history of John Wilkes Booth. These are some of the books which continue to be cited as people try to develop the documentation of the conspiracy theories. We have this important statue from Central Park is, of course, William Shakespeare. Perhaps the last good thing that John Wilkes Booth did was to appear on stage with his celebrated family at a public benefit performance in New York City in June 1865. This was Booth's last performance of any kind. With the object of raising money to erect a statue of Shakespeare in Central Park, Booth portrayed Mark Antony in a performance of Julius Caesar. The tribute to the master of the theater still stands and serves as a reminder of that little good that came before one of the most sinister acts in American history. Why have these conspiracy theories been so persistent? This cartoon was drawn when the new Kennedy assassination records were released last month. There seem to be three categories of those who remain skeptical about the historical record. The theories stem from one, the conflicting testimony of some of the reputed witnesses. Two, concerns about the questions that have not been definitively resolved by the historical record. And three, the existence of problematic testimony and records that, while they cannot be verified, appeal to skeptics. And then there are theories that were started by fraud, creating documents to support a discredited line of inquiry. These also can acquire a life of their own and attract other proponents. And as this cartoon suggests, people who engage in conspiracy theories and consume as much documentation as you give them, they are never quite satisfied and never change their opinion. We are fortunate to have so many talented scholars who have developed a substantial and credible record of the people and events around the assassination. They have based their work on the actual records and verifiable sources. I call out especially the late James O. Hall of the Mary Surratt Society, who has provided invaluable research in discrediting many of the more scurrilous themes. We're also fortunate, of course, to have our own Ed Steers, and a fellow who approached me recently to talk about his book was Frank Gorman, who I had hoped might be available tonight. He is an attorney in Baltimore who was actually involved in the last trial, which rejected the request to disinter Booth's body to again establish his identity. That is a phenomenal book too, in describing all the historical record that made this case unsustainable. So thanks very much for your attention. That concludes what I have to tell you. Now let's hear what's on your mind.
So if everybody has any questions, just open up your mic and ask your question to John, and he'll do as many as he could get to.
John, it's John Swallow. And are most of these conspiracy theorists of a northern persuasion or had ancestors that served in the Union forces or something, or are they Southern, or is there any breakdown at all?
I've not seen a breakdown, but from what I've read, I suspect that it's pretty even. There are people who are just fascinated with conspiracies and want to keep them going as they like. But of course, there's a whole school of these theories around the lost cause. And so certainly Southern in nature. But I've not seen a breakdown now.
I have a question. Of all these conspiracies, is there any evidence, actual evidence supporting any of them? Or they just kind of made up and then people ran with it?
Yeah, they take pieces of evidence and build on that. They find a witness that nobody else knew about. They find some other aspect of documentation which nobody else can seem to lay their hands on, and use that to blow out something which was not as fully developed as they would like at trial. And certainly there are gaps in the record, no question. But you have to look at the context and the great mass of the historical record and draw your conclusions from that. They usually disregard the context.
I would add to that, John, there's evidence, it's just not credible. There's a lot of things that are very sketchy, and you mentioned that very well in your talk about, well, suddenly we have this transcripted copy and they have some elaborate story where it came from, but the original somehow got lost. So it's always these evidence that's not really evidence kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of trying to get at with evidence, is that evidence, in my mind, as a former scientist, is actual evidence. It's not somebody says something, that doesn't count as evidence. That's hearsay. Somebody says something and then there's something written or something published, or even some time and place that makes it more plausible, then you start getting into what's evidence. And it sounds like a lot of these were like all the Booth ones. Booth lived, and he lived for many more years, and then he finally died, and now he's a mummy, and he's he's being shopped around for money. Obviously, that was things where people just said stuff and then they ran with it.
Mhm.
But I guess the only evidence is really attacking questionable uh, the questionable witness testimony,
Yeah.
because there were some that lied and there were some that said things that are maybe not as plausible or as credible as they would need to be.
And what a boon the internet has been to that, where people can invent a story out of whole cloth, and somebody who is less informed runs with it and adds to it. It goes on and on.
Yeah, that's the problem. We got a lot of people who just love running with something, no matter what the credibility of it is. Dan Pritchard has his hand up. I need take off your mute. There you go.
I was just thinking the evidence. Didn't Booth have some contact with Confederate agents in Canada in the months before? And then John Surratt himself was a Confederate agent. So what about because the first theory about Confederate involvement, that's the only one that seems to be plausible at all. But what do you think about those contacts? Or
Well, I agree.
As plausible or as credible as they would need to be.
And what a boon the internet has been to that, where people can invent a story out of whole cloth, and somebody who is less informed runs with it and adds to it. It goes on and on.
Yeah, that's the problem. We got a lot of people who just love running with something, no matter what the credibility of it is. Dan Pritchard has his hand up. I need take off your mute. There you go.
I was just thinking the evidence. Didn't Booth have some contact with Confederate agents in Canada in the months before? And then John Surratt himself was a Confederate agent. So what about because the first theory about Confederate involvement, that's the only one that seems to be plausible at all. But what do you think about those contacts? Or
well, I agree. There was definitely contact with Confederate officers, and some of those officers had direct contact with cabinet officers in the Confederate government. But there seems to be in the research, there's a dividing line where certain resources were made available to Booth. He was given money from the Confederates, maybe about $20,000. He was given contacts. It was the Confederate agent who put him in touch with Dr. Mudd. So this network of contacts, but whether or not the orders actually came from Richmond there's no hard evidence of that. Certainly, there would not have been time for anyone in Richmond to know that the plot had changed from kidnapping to murder. So it's unlikely they were involved in that short time interval with that decision that Booth apparently made really on the spot. But it is fascinating that the records of the Confederate Secret Service are really just being developed. People haven't really accessed those until recent years, and there's a lot more information to be gleaned there. There were several attempts at bombing the White House. Certainly, there was coordination in the incident of Lincoln's hat being shot off, riding from the soldiers' home. So there are suggestions in the record that the Confederate government was more involved than we may have realized in attempts at assassination. But were they involved in the full details of Booth's plan? There's not much evidence to support that.
Well, what was the reactions of the Booth family that lived to? I mean, obviously, what they couldn't convince the public that our brother, our son, did it, and the ones that lived into the 18 whatevers, how did they react? And also, what's the geographic, if you know, prior to the internet, of these conspiracy theorists? Are they living within our region primarily, overseas Civil War, American Civil War buffs? I mean, I assume it's got to be the conspiracy theory theorists have to be largely 90+% American.
Oh yes, yeah, they're in this country, no question. But you say which region? I'm not sure they're more in the South or Illinois or elsewhere. But there was a lot of interest nationally in these conspiracy theories about Lincoln and the other assassinations as well. So, but I couldn't hone in on where they were more prevalent.
Mm-hmm. And how did
the Booth family, they withdrew from public life for a long time. There was shame attached to their family, and they recognized that and behaved appropriately, I think. They never questioned that was their son who was buried, even though he was exhumed twice by complaints of others, not the family. Yeah, there were certain surgical marks and dental records that were easily confirmed and were from the beginning.
Yeah, Booth had a boil removed from his neck, and they had a scar, and they brought the doctor who did it. And he said, "That's my scar." They brought him down to the Navy Yard where they did the autopsy. And he said, "Yeah, that's Booth. That's the scar from me."
Exactly.
Yeah, I just recently in Atlanta in my Society of Civil War Surgeons gave my Charles Leal talk, and I could, in researching that, I like you. I mean, you find these conspiracies, but nothing that holds any water makes any sense. The reason they took him to the Peterson house is like it was a great shot you showed. There was a boarder, Henry Safford, who stepped out on the stoop at the Peterson house. He said, "Bring him in here." I don't think he consulted anybody else in there.
It is amazing they had not made that decision. Yeah,
and that's why they ended up in the Peterson house.
Right. That painting, "Born by Loving Hands," is
yeah,
my witness account of that event. Yeah.
Yeah. Bonnie, you had a question.
I bought the Dark Horse book, might have been in 2003, without realizing that it was a conspiracy. And I was really taken aback by things that I read, but I wondered if you, John, know anything about the conspiracy that when they shot to kill John Wilkes Booth, that there were people that said, "No, you should have taken him alive," and that he was killed to keep him quiet. That, I believe I got that from that book. Do you know anything about that assertion?
Well, that's the assertions out there. Yes, Boston Corbett acted on his own. In his defense, he said that he was protecting his own troops. That Booth had a weapon and was about to fire on one of the other soldiers. So he thought.
He also said God ordered him to do it.
Well, that was later. Yeah. But there's no evidence that Corbett had any connections with Stanton or people in a conspiracy mode. So that kind of falls apart on the face. Granted, it did seem suspicious that he was killed rather than taken alive. But as any good police officer would say, if you think one of your own is threatened, you've got to take him out. So the reason given made sense. And in fact, Booth did survive long enough to make a few comments to the captors. And nothing came out of that. Now, one of the conspiracy theories is that soldiers who claimed they were at the scene said that the man taken out of the barn, in fact, had red hair. It was not, they could tell right away that it wasn't Booth. And that starts a whole conspiracy on its own there. But there's just too much documentation from too many people who were there that testified that they recognized Booth. And he said the things that he said, and it all led to him. Some of the issues related to his so-called diary, one of the more spectacular Booth wannabes claimed that while he was hiding in the swamp at a campsite, Booth had misplaced his diary, and it was found by a fellow who was trying to catch up with him to return it to him, and that was the guy who was in the barn. So Booth was never in the barn and never got to Garrett. So that people have spun an incredible range of versions of this, which really fall apart once you start to look into what the range of witnesses had said.
John, it's Matt. Can I?
Go ahead.
Can you elaborate on? You said there was some evidence on the shooting outside the soldier's home that hit his hat. Can you elaborate on was there evidence about Southern conspiracy in that?
Well, there was an assassination team that had been set out from the Confederate Secret Service looking for an opportunity. It was a modestly planned effort. People had staked out the route that he took to his to the carriage house, to the summer cottage. And while there is no document that I'm aware of that says they knew who took the shot, there was clearly a plan to shadow the president and look for that opportunity.
Never knew that. Thank you.
One clarification, please. I mean, you talked about how Booth appeared for a benefit for Shakespeare, and 1 beer ago, I heard you say that the date of it was June 1865.
Yeah.
Of course, Booth was dead by then, but
No, it was 64.
So I'm sorry, 64, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is also in the audience to that performance was Dr. Charles Leal. He was yes, that was the night the Confederates firebombed New York.
Right.
And they got trapped in the theater, and he had to treat people, but he wanted to see the Booth brothers, and he was a big theater guy, and he was there.
He had just made contact with Surratt in May, and he had stopped giving performances, but agreed to do that one. The last money he made was in February. That was
with his brothers he appeared.
Janet, you had a question?
Yeah, John, since John Surratt probably wasn't aware of the plot to kill Lincoln, if he was in Canada, and that happened so quickly, what kind of evidence was presented against him at his trial?
There was communication. There were letters with Booth and Dr. Mudd. There was, what else? A lot of witnesses citing the two of them together. And in fact, the conspirators themselves had named Surratt before he was hung. Not his mother, of course.
But all of that was in the time period when they were planning the kidnapping,
Yes.
and prior to it, because he wasn't around the day of the assassination.
Yeah, he was in Elmira. He was in Elmira, New York, actually. They had sent the senator to scout out the prison camp in Elmira. Then the war ended, but that's where Surratt was.
I think a lot of the testimony and the evidence-ish that was presented at the conspirators' trials was just rehashed for Surratt once they finally caught him, and it was a year or two later, whatever, that he was tried.
Yeah,
he was also tried in a civilian court as opposed to the military tribunal.
Yeah. Plus, the public temperature had calmed down.
Yeah, it was quite a long time.
And he tried to go on the stage and make money about it, but apparently wasn't very successful.
I would add a clarification there, John. You mentioned that John Surratt was found not guilty. That's not actually true.
It was a hung jury.
It was a hung jury.
Yeah.
So at any time he could have been retried. He was not found guilty, nor was he acquitted. They just couldn't agree on which it was. So.
Which in legal terms is not guilty, but that's
yeah. I think
he was not found not guilty. He was not guilty. That's true, but there's a difference between verdict being rendered. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's always the thing.
He was not in D.C. at the time of the assassination, at least.
Not being found guilty doesn't mean the same thing as innocent. Dan, you had another question?
Yeah, do we know who sent that team that about the time that Lincoln's hat was shot off? Who sent that squad or whoever?
There
You know?
was a head of the Confederate Secret Service in Washington, a colonel. I'm blocking on his name. Yes, he organized. There was a Confederate officer.
It was the Secret Service, yeah.
He also he developed a plan to put a bomb in the White House just before they beefed up security at the White House. So he had to cancel that plan, but he still had organized scouts in the D.C. area who were tracking Lincoln's movements. I'm sorry, I can't think of his name. I mixed something.
So there was a definite Confederate plot to kill Lincoln. It maybe wasn't the one that succeeded, but there was a definite plan from the Secret Service anyway.
Yes.
Can you talk more about the Secret Service documents that the Confederate and what we know about them, or how much has been learned?
I really can't. I've not looked into them myself.
Okay.
I'm trying to think where they are. They
probably no smoking gun, of course.
Well, Lincoln created a Secret Service on the day of his assassination, but that was for counterfeiting because of the greenbacks.
I'm talking about the Confederate Secret Service, right?
Oh, okay.
You're talking about the Confederate Secret Service, right, John?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know how much more organized they were as a Secret Service, the way we think of Secret Service, but that information, somebody has looked at it, and I'm sure somebody would have written a book if there were some smoking gun.
If there was a smoking gun, right?
No smoking gun, of course.
A lot of those papers were burned as they exited Richmond as well from the Confederate
Right.
government. So
That's true,
there are little that survive, and what there is, like you said, there was no smoking guns. Literally or figuratively, I guess.
A bit off the subject, but I mean, Lincoln was getting death threats, lots and lots of death threats. Was there any books on the, how many type, how, I mean, he just put them in, according to Burlingame, just put them in a file or something that, death threats against me or something. Was there any books on all those death threats that he was even getting them as president-elect, which is why Pinkerton protected him on the way to Washington. I mean, so he was just thinking, just another.
That was a real plot that he saved them from.
Right. Yes. Okay. It's on. Not. I listened to the Hour Peril book a decade ago, but it wasn't 100%. The Baltimore 8 people wasn't really confirmed as whether they were really conspired or not. There was probable, but no evidence that would make it definitive.
That's the Baltimore plot when he was going to the inauguration you're talking about.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That they had I think a barber, and they all were supposed to draw straws, and whoever had the short straw, you're the one to be assassinating him. But everybody thought they had the short straw. So all 8 people thought, I'm the one that's supposed to assassinate Lincoln. This is according to the Hour Peril, but it's not, and Pinkerton had a number of people involved, setting up various brokerage offices and other things to try. I don't know how many people were under Pinkerton, but to investigate these possible assassination plots or plans.
I think Ted Widmer's book goes into that.
Washington.
I think Ted Widmer's book goes into that a little bit. I think that's where I saw it. Bill Walsh had a question. What's your question, Bill?
Do you think that Lincoln's fatalism had any role in his assassination?
Just in waving off his security, man.
That's my point. I mean, he did that repeatedly throughout his presidential career.
Yep.
And survived a few occasions, but this last one he didn't. That's okay. Then he waived off his security. Lamon was also missing, but he was sent down south, I think.
He sent him to Richmond, yeah.
He
You know?
quit because he wouldn't take his security seriously. Huh?
What would have saved him is if Grant would have gone with him instead of Rathbone, because Grant would have had security.
Well, I'm not sure what the security would do in that situation. Here's John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor, waving his card to go in and see who would stop him and who would frisk him. You know, everything was set up specifically for the event. So I think Booth covered himself. I'm not sure any other security measures from that time would have been effective.
Yeah, and it wasn't uncommon to carry knives and small guns and stuff on you. It wasn't illegal to do. Edgar, you had a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was wondering if there are any records or memoirs from any of the Union guards who guarded the conspirators. Did any of them speak with the conspirators? Did they have thoughts or interactions with them? And how would I find a record of who was assigned to the prison and I guess to the ship, if I'm understanding it correctly?
Communication was forbidden. For most of their confinement, they wore those hoods.
Inside 24 hours a day? Or
right. I'm not aware of a guard writing a book.
No, I don't think so.
John Hantraft, who was the guard, wrote a book. His journal survived, and it was published right here.
Yeah, who
This was
who
Holzer
worked
and
on that, right?
Ed Steers and Harold Holzer edited this book. It's the confinement as recorded in the letter book of John Frederick Hantraft.
Okay.
Right.
And he
Yeah,
did have a journal that he had kept that has been published.
And what does he reveal?
Nothing. I mean, he just basically talks about what happened day to day with them. Yeah, I mean, he talks about he did this or did that. It's just an accounting of a journal, what his day-to-day activities were. There's not a lot of,
right,
like you had said, John, there was not a lot of personal interactions. That just was not allowed. So
yeah, I remember reading that. It was all basic stuff. There were not visitors. The only one who had visitors was Mary Surratt with her daughter, right?
Her daughter, it did also talk about they did have clergy that were allowed to visit them, but the clergy were not going to give their accounts much later. They just weren't going to reveal what was said in some of those things. There was a couple of the clergy that did do some general speaking later about what they had talked with the conspirators about, but it was not, again, no particular revelations there.
Oh, thank you.
John, I would add one book to your list as well. The Lincoln Murder Conspiracies by William Hanchett, which really does take apart all those conspiracies. It's an excellent book. William Hanchett was one of the people who you mentioned Gorman's book that he just wrote about them trying to dig up John Wilkes Booth. William Hanchett was one of the people that testified in that trial as well.
Okay, in Baltimore. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. This was an excellent book. This is the one I go to that debunks the conspiracy stuff. It kind of takes them very similar actually to the ones you had, John. I think your list was excellent as far as the sort of those main conspiracies. So he runs through them. So
I wonder how that compares with Gorman's book. Huh?
I think Gorman talks more about he goes really more into the Booth survival one because that impacted directly the court case that he was involved in the 90s. This one goes through a lot more of the Stanton did it, all the ones you mentioned, he kind of runs through them. And the other one I would mention, there's a chapter in Ed Steers' book, Lincoln Legends, Myth, and Hoax, where he talks specifically about the missing pages in the Booth diary and about how this whole idea that George Julian is all bunk and the Lew Wallace stuff is all bunk, and there's all kinds of stuff that he talks about in that as well.
The ground has been well covered, but the real information doesn't get as spread as widely as it needs to. You got people like Bill O'Reilly who still want to make.
Oh God!
That's a big problem because like you said, it was 20 million books sold or some ridiculous amount.
That ridiculous.
I mean, he has a lot more influence on what happens, what people learn, than all of us publishing together. And
indeed,
and it's wrong. And it's wrong. John, you said one of the John Parker, I think, was the
John F.
guard.
Parker,
Yeah, he was the policeman.
And then there was another one there that was supposed to be guard.
Charles Forbes, the valet.
Forbes.
He was the valet only, yeah.
Did either one of them get talked to by Stanton's people and were they witnesses at
Well,
the
they were all
trial?
talked to, but there was nothing that they could divulge. Parker, like I said, he had a troubled record. He was fired before that. He was retained on the specific request of Mary Lincoln, who thought that he was a good guy. Afterwards, she didn't think so much. She did blame Parker, but Parker was never released from the force until he was caught napping on the job in the late 1870s. So, yeah, nothing fell on him. No.
Charles Forbes was an interesting story. There is no recording of him having given any statement officially. Terry Alford, in his book on John Wilkes Booth, postulates a theory, which I happen to have said myself some years ago. Terry has a little bit more evidence that he didn't reveal in his book, but that the card that was presented to Charles Forbes was not John Wilkes Booth presenting his own card. It was the card of Senator Ira Hale, which Hale was the father of Lucy Hale, Booth's secret fiance. The theory was then that he had taken one of Hale's cards, and that was what he used to gain entrance. And because of that, because of the potential involvement of Senator Hale in his card, Ford's testimony was quieted. Even though it didn't vindicate anybody, didn't blame him, it was just to keep it quiet. Shortly after that, Senator Hale was posted in Spain, I believe, and his daughter went with him. So there is some things that say they wanted them out of the picture because it would be.
They found Lucy Hale's picture on Booth's body.
Yes, that's right.
Along with 4 other women too.
I had the opportunity. You talked about Lew Wallace and where they found those papers was supposedly in the carriage
how
house
easy it is for some.
Yeah, they found them supposedly in his carriage house.
Yeah.
In April of 2015, I spoke on the Lincoln assassination and their trial. I did 2 talks, both of them delivered in that carriage house.
No kidding.
At the Lew Wallace study in Crawfordsville here. And the question came up about what you said, those papers. Lew Wallace was the most meticulous writer, if you look at his records and everything, and they were just appalled at the idea that Lew Wallace would have left any papers out in the carriage house to be destroyed. They said that would have never happened. So they're the people that are running his museum in his home now say there is no way that would have ever happened. They were familiar with Lew Wallace and his habits. That would not have happened.
Edgar, did you have another question?
Oh,
you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. No, I'll lower my hand.
Okay, Bill, did you have another question?
Yeah, along the lines of Booth's character, John, you said that Booth's family was highly embarrassed by the assassination and they withdrew from the public. Why was Booth the bad apple of the family? Any idea?
Well, he enjoyed the South. He thought his best experiences were there. He was always a loyal Southerner. I don't know of anything else, but I see.
Well, there's a theory that, number one, Edwin sort of made him act in the South so he would be in the North, which was more prestigious. And that there was always this sibling rivalry between him and Edwin. And that one of his motivations for killing Lincoln was it would make him more famous than his brother.
I think Terry Alford pretty much debunked that.
I know. But that is a theory that's out there. I just say it to mention that is. I know that Terry doesn't.
That's a conspiracy theory, John. You're promoting conspiracy theories.
Speaking of conspiracy theories, John, you had
exactly.
mentioned the one about Johnson. It was Johnson that did it because he most benefited. Other than the fact that he was the obvious most direct one to benefit from that because he became president, which is probably questionable how much of a benefit that was. But was there any evidence suggested or any suggestion of evidence suggested about how he might have been involved in somehow taking out Lincoln so he could become president?
I don't think there was any deep investigation there. It was an initial thought, but quickly dispelled. I'm delighted to see that Ed Steers is with us, and certainly want to have him weigh into this discussion.
Yeah, really.
John Wilkes Booth did leave a card for Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood House that said, "Are you in your room?" That card exists. It's still in the National Archives. So there
what makes you think it was left for him, for Johnson?
Well, I just always that was always the thing that was put forth, that it was there, that it was in Johnson's box. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that isn't. Well, I believe it was for William Browning.
Oh, really?
Johnson's secretary, and he wanted to find Johnson's schedule. And of course, John Wilkes Booth was a good friend of William Browning, and I think that's pretty much.
And that was more just to find out if Johnson was home, so that they knew where the other, whether it be Adzerat or whoever was assigned to.
Yeah, he wanted to scope it out so that he could tell Adzerat when he'd be there and when he could go kill him.
Yeah.
Well, as Azerot got too drunk to do anything. So.
Well, he wasn't drunk. I mean,
that's why they always say he got drunk and lost his nerve.
Well, usually when you get drunk, you have your nerve.
You get more nerve.
you don't lose it. You do stupid things like assassinate the vice president.
Ed, there's a question in the box I want to pose to you. Are there any Lincoln assassination records that have not been released?
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. You know, it's like Atzerat's lost confession. I mean, there's stuff that's fallen through the cracks that just hasn't turned up, I'm sure. But I came into this late. I was away, so I missed the major presentation.
Delighted you're here. You should have given this, Ed, but I gave you all the kudos.
No, but
good presentation.
But of course, those papers you talked about that Lew Wallace had in his carriage house is the core of the conspiracy. You know, this is what Jesus, I'm forgetting names like crazy. This is our good friend Ray Neff. You know, he's promoted this.
Yes,
was able to convince Indiana State University of it, and they accepted his entire archives. Well,
what are your thoughts on Eisenschimel?
Well, I think he was a self-promoter who came up with a great idea at the right time and had a bestseller. I think he knew better. I mean, if he'd done any research at all, and he did do research, he was a good researcher. I think he was disingenuous. I can say that now. He can't sue me. He's dead.
May I give a shout out to James O'Hall?
Yes.
Wonderful work.
Yes. Well, he's the dean of assassination scholars, and I think he always will be. I mean, he's the stuff that guy uncovered is incredible, and the way he did research is just incredible. I have nothing but great admiration for him. I spent my whole life in research at the NIH with some of the most brilliant researchers, and Hall ranks with every one of them. You know, I went on several trips with him chasing ghosts. I mean, that's the kind of guy I was. You know, we tried to track down Booth, the missing pages from Booth's diary on a couple of occasions. We probably put in close to 2,000 miles driving to various places to where the missing pages were now kept.
And that was my first. He sent a letter to my father, looking for those pages.
Yeah,
because
we had a lot of fun doing it. Knowing they were bogus, we still put in all this effort, traveled all over, but we had a wonderful time doing it. And yeah, it's he is the dean. There's no doubt about it. Man, he was incredible.
Oh, back to the Booths, if we could. Okay, were the Booths Southern? Their whole family? I mean, Edwin was Unionist. What about their father? And because I mean, it's and
he was dead.
Well, when did he? Didn't he? Was their father?
He dragged himself to death.
55?
Junius Brutus Booth died fairly early because he was quite a drinker.
He died in the early 1850s.
Yeah, he was friends with Sam Houston.
Yeah, and then Edwin was definitely a Unionist, and he ended up, after taking some time off to avoid being killed by association, he ended up going back into the theater and becoming huge in the North, in New York. Had the Players Club in New York. You can still see a statue of him.
Well, he started it, yeah.
Yeah. The other one, I wrote something for the Lincolnian website last year sometime about Junius Brutus Booth Jr. or second or whatever, if I got his name right, who he ended up in New England, in Boston, had a theater, he and his wife. And then I wrote about him because he went to and set up a theater and had a hotel rather, and a little theater in Manchester, Massachusetts, which is where my mother grew up and my grandmother lived. And I went there all the time, drove past the cemetery for 100 times at least without knowing that he was buried there, along with his wife and 2 or 3 of the kids. And I went and saw the gravestones this past a year ago or so. So I wrote about that for the Lincolnian website. So he ended up mainly in Boston. So he probably was more Unionist. And then Asia, the sister, she was the one that John Wilkes Booth was the closest to. And as far as I know, she never tried to cover for him or anything. She just, he did it, but, and then she just sort of stayed away from things, got married and stayed away from people so that she wouldn't be harassed.
Moved to England.
Moved to England. Okay, she moved to England.
John Sleeper Clark was her husband, was another actor. Right. England.
Yeah. So I think Booth was the only one that was, if there were Southern sympathies of the others, they weren't extreme like John Wilkes Booth. But he was also, maybe they all were, but he was extremely racially motivated as well, because it was at that April 11th speech, that Lincoln's last speech that he gave at the White House, that he decided, forget this whole kidnapping thing, it's time to just take him out.
And we know now through historians, but I mean, but for Mary Todd Lincoln's behavior, thinking that the other generals' wives were trying to hit on her husband down in Richmond when that group went down to Richmond, that Julia Dent didn't want to accept the invitation to Ford's Theater, the American Cult's cousin. What did Grant, if we know, think in the latter part of 1865 about, if I had only been there, or regrets that obviously everybody regretted, especially Grant, that that Lincoln was assassinated. But what did Grant think about his their decision not to accept the Lincoln's offer to join him at Ford's Theater, if we know? At least Ulysses.
Never seen Grant. I've never seen anything that Grant wrote talking about regretting that he hadn't been there. Like you said, I'm sure he did. I just haven't seen anything written that he wrote.
I do believe Grant felt that had he been there, he might have prevented it, but there's no chance he was going to be there because Julia just detested Mary Lincoln. There's
Right.
zero chance that they would be there.
Was Mary ever implicated in any of these conspiracy theories? Like she was conspired with somebody else to have him killed because of all these debts she was carrying? And
yes.
Ed, you may remember that one too. There's a transcript that I read in the ALPLM in Springfield where a woman was on the radio, I believe in the 50s, and she gave an account that as a little girl, maybe it was earlier in the 50s, that she had been there, and it was Mary Lincoln that killed Lincoln. And then she goes through this whole thing about the lasso came out and pulled Booth off the stage. Do you remember reading that one, Ed? Have you ever seen that?
Yes. Yeah.
That's the funniest and most outrageous one. And she was the only one that saw what happened, she also claimed.
She slipped the Derringer out of her purse.
Yes.
Behind Lincoln's head just as Booth walked in. And Booth said, "Oh my God, I better get out of here." And she fired the gun.
And then he left. Yeah.
And he jumped over the balustrade. Oh, there's so many crazy theories.
I must have missed that one.
Wildly crazy. God.
I think that's probably about the craziest one I left. And the transcript, like I said, I don't know if the original recording still exists, but I would love to hear her relate the story. I've seen the transcript, but boy, to hear that must have been something else.
It's insane.
And the fact they put it on the radio gave it credibility in that sense. It's crazy.
Can I just comment on the Grant thing? Because this just will not die. That had Grant accompanied the Lincolns to the theater, he would have been accompanied by staff and guards, and Booth could have never gained access to the box. And that just simply won't die. And it is completely false because on February the 11th, which is 2 months before, Grant went to Ford's Theater with Booth and Burnside. The three of them went to see Love and Livery, which John Sleeper Clark starred in. There was no guards that accompanied Grant at the time, no staff, and the three of them sat in a box by themselves. And during that performance, 2 messengers from the War Telegraph Office walked into the box unopposed and handed Lincoln telegrams from the War Department Telegraph Office. So I think that
Grant went with Booth.
Pardon me?
Grant went with Lincoln.
With Booth.
Grant went with Lincoln.
He meant Lincoln.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Grant, Lincoln, and Burnside went to the theater to see Love and Livery.
Yeah.
And
I don't think he went with Booth. No.
No. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm at that stage now where I have this problem. The grandchildren have to wear name tags. So, I mean, this puts the kibosh on it because these 3 guys sat through a double theater, and there was no staff, no guards, and access, as usual, access to Lincoln in the box was very easy and absolute. So,
well, Lincoln was the first presidential assassination. So before that, there really wasn't the kind of protection that, I mean, nowadays there's literally 50 Secret Service guys around the president.
Well, what
at
did
any given time.
Seward, of course, made the famous statement, assassination is not in the American character.
Well, it is. It
he
became one.
Suddenly it was.
It wasn't the only misstatement that he made either.
Suddenly it was.
They created the Secret Service for counterfeiting.
Yeah. Okay, so are there any other questions for John or Ed Steers?
Yes. Their father wrote a letter in, I think, 1835, indicating he intended to kill Andrew Jackson, the president. That didn't happen, but it seems like father, like son to a small degree. Does anybody can expand on that? I don't remember all I read before. It was a couple pages.
Apparently, somebody approached Jackson with 2 guns, fired both of them at Jackson, and they both misfired.
That's correct. And then he beat him with a cane.
What?
Yeah, he did.
Jackson beat the attacker with a cane.
Ed, since you're probably our biggest expert on this call, I'm sure, not probably, you are.
Yes.
Does that ring true to you that Booth's father had said that he would shoot Jackson?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, but he wasn't serious. I mean, he
Right.
hated Jackson, as a lot of people did politically. I'm sure
he said a lot of things he didn't mean because he was he did like his
and
drink.
remember, Booth did not set out to kill Lincoln. That was not his purpose. There was no benefit to Booth in killing Lincoln. He wanted to take him hostage and exchange him, for the Confederate prisoners being held at Elmira and Douglas, and which was a good plot, which was a good scheme, and it had a great possibility of being pulled off. But of course, when Richmond fell, there was no place to take Lincoln and no place to bargain with him. So his plot fell apart, and he rolled it over to assassination with the idea.
Ed, wasn't there what really made up his mind when he attended Lincoln's speech at the White House and he heard him propose that the African Americans vote?
Well,
and he turned and he said, that means N-word citizenship. I'll run them through.
Yeah, but he didn't say that. That's
a fake too.
Yeah, George Alfred Townsend wrote that into his novel Katie at Catoctin, but he did say that is the last speech he will ever make. Now I will put him through, but he didn't.
Yeah,
he didn't say that means, Negro.
No, he didn't say that part.
No, George Alfred Townsend added that. As a good journalist, he spiced up his art.
John O'Brien, do you have anything you want to leave us with? A final statement?
Delighted you all stuck with me this evening. Ed, very much appreciate your being here particularly. And thanks for the comments and contributions that each of you has made to Lincoln Scholarship. Thank you. Remember that Monday, the 14th, is the 160th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. I ask you all to take a moment to be thoughtful, to consider something about Lincoln and what his legacy means to you individually. Certainly, it means a great deal to our country. Thank you very much for your attention. See you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you all. And remember the 22nd, some guy named Scott Schrader is going to talk about Lincoln's time in Indiana.
Yeah, I wonder what he knows about Indiana, that guy.
Yeah, I think this guy Scott lives there or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, the 22nd, same time, 6:00. If you don't have the link, look at the website. It's on there. And hopefully we'll see you all then. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank John for a special presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks for filling in.
Thank
Dave.
you.